Hello everyone and welcome back to another video here on Ghost Paper. For this mini tutorial session, I actually wanted to create this really cool stylized eye, and I wanted to take you through step by step on how to actually recreate this eye, which has some really nice shading, has some like stylized kind of look and feel to it. So if you want to learn how to actually create this element, stick around to the end of this video and grab your iPad because we are just about to start. And for the credit on this illustration, the credit goes to Edgar Rosso. You should definitely check his Instagram. He does an amazing job about using geometry to create his illustrations. And one last thing, guys, if the video feels that is going too fast for you, make sure to use the speed setting on the YouTube player. You can set it to 0.5. You can pause at any second, and you can try to follow the steps a little slower. So if it's going a little fast, always make sure to go at the pace that it works the best for you. For the brushes that we're going to use for this illustration, it's actually quite simple. We're going to be using the two free brushes that I have in the description box of this video. These are two free brushes that I have on my Gumroad page, and the last one is going to be in the airbrushing section of Procreate, and is a brush that already comes with Procreate, and is the soft brush for a lot of these gradients that we see here. Some of those we're going to be creating with the very harsh brush and just applying some Gaussian blur. But don't worry, because we'll take you through step by step on how to create this. So now, without any further ado, let's get started. First, I'm just going to create a screen size canvas and zoom out a little bit. And now I'm just going to make sure that we have our drawing guides. For my drawing guides, I'm probably going to edit drawing guides, make sure the thickness and opacity are at max so that the camera can capture that a little bit better. And I'm actually setting my grid size to about 191 pixels. So I'm just going to hit done. And this is all information just to make sure that you guys can follow step by step here. So on our very first layer, I'm going to be using the third color here on our color palette. Make sure I got my ink brush. And I'm just going to bring it down to about 7%. And first, we're just going to draw a nice circle. Just going to zoom out. And now I'm just going to make sure that the eyeball is at the center of the screen. I'm also going to scale it down just a little bit. All right. So something like this. And now we're just going to drop a color onto the eyeball. Now we're going to go into the layers panel, make a new layer, and on the bottom layer, which I'm setting at the bottom, we're just going to drop this red color as the background. So now let's go and make another layer, and this time we're going to go and choose this blue or teal color. Make sure that we're still on our same brush, and now we're going to make another circle. And this is going to start becoming the iris for our eyeball. So I want to make sure that it's a circle. I'm going to move that, center it. Here we go. And once again, drop the color. And now one last circle is going to be this very dark blue color here. Make sure that we are selected on another layer. And this is going to be the last part of the iris. Once again, I'm gonna move. I actually like to use the move tool after I create the shape instead of just clicking edit shape and moving it around, because sometimes when you do that, you don't really get the axis here. The Bezier points are not really centered. So I prefer to actually create the shape first, use the move tool to actually find it in the very center of the picture. So now basically this is the base layers for our illustration. So now I'm just going to go into the actions menu, and I'm going to turn off drawing guides just for now. And back into the layers panel, we're going to start our shading and, actually adding light and shadows to this illustration. So first, we're going to go here onto our background layer, create a new layer, and set this into a clipping mask. We're going to be using a lot of clipping masks in this illustration. So in case you don't know what clipping masks are, these are basically layers that once you create them and set them as clipping masks, you can create layers and just click on the layers and set them as clipping masks, or if you already have one, any layers that you create just in the middle of clipping masks or below clipping masks. So if you have your first clipping mask here, if you just create one, it's already set to clipping masks. And what are clipping masks? Basically, all of these layers that you create that are set to clipping masks, they have this little arrow here, almost going on a chain reaction back to a base layer. So basically what they do is that they all respect the boundaries of a base layer. So you can paint, you can do whatever you want. They will never paint over or outside the boundaries of your base layer. In this case here, because we're dealing with a background that's fully painted onto the canvas, it's not really necessary to use clipping masks, but I do like to use them in order to keep my illustration as organized as possible. So I'm just going to delete all these clipping masks because I really just need one for now. We're going to go into our brush library. And for this one, we're actually going to, let's see what we can use here. I'm thinking that we're actually going to use our ink brush, but now I'm going to set it at the maximum size. So now I'm just going to make a bit of a curve here. Sort of like this. Paint over. Just to make sure that we have a very solid region. And now we're going to click on adjustments, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur this background or this element about 65% or so. We're going to apply that, go back into the layers panel, set this as multiply. As for opacity, probably gonna leave it about 50%. All right, so I'm gonna make another layer, set a clipping mask, and now probably using the airbrush, I just wanna make sure that I get a little bit more of the corners painted. So I'm just gonna play around here, making a few strokes. Basically something like this. And once again, I'm just gonna blur this once again. So this is going to be kind of like the base or like the floor shadows of our illustration, but more like the vignetting of our illustration. We haven't done the shadows onto the eyeball itself. So for the shadows on the eyeball, we're actually going to turn back on our drawing guides, go into the layers panel, make a new layer, and now we're going to use our very harsh brush, the studio pen, and I'm just going to reduce it to about 5%, and we're going to draw a disc. I'm going to hold with my other hand here onto the canvas so that it becomes a perfect shape, and I'm just going to bring it in so the shadow should be not the same width of the eye, but just about just a little inside onto the eye. If you look here on the drawing guides, you can have a sense of how much it should be. Now we're just going to squish this shape quite a bit, bring it here so that it's just a little bit inside at the bottom, and drop a color. And that's going to be, for now, the shadow at the floor stage, the shadow of the eyeball onto the floor. So let's continue. Now what we want to do is to actually start adding shadows onto the eyeball. So we're going to click on our base layer, make a new layer, and if you probably guessed it, once again, we're going to be using a lot of clipping masks so that we can paint elements and not really have to worry about the boundaries of these elements, of painting outside these boundaries. So because we just did the shadows, I can once again just turn off the drawing guides, kind of see my drawing a little bit more clear. Make sure that we have our layer selected. We're going to go on to the airbrush one. And now we're gonna paint this really nice kind of a side or like angular shadow here. I'm going to use Gaussian blur, but just a little bit. I just wanna see what it can do for us. Probably set it about 20% or so. And in terms of blending mode, we're actually going to use hard light. So this is going to be one layer. Now let's create another one, set it to clipping mask, and also set it to hard light. And this time we're going to go onto the brush starters and use the pressure brush. So what we want right now is to actually start with very low pressure, apply quite a bit of pressure, and end with low pressure. But I'm going to increase the size to the biggest size and do that once again. So low pressure, a lot of pressure, and low pressure again. And you just need to get something like that. Don't have to worry too much because we're going to blur it. So back into the Gaussian blur, we're going to set a little bit of blur, and this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a shape that has these like two level shadows. We have a very kind of open shadow, and then we have a darker, a bit more constrained kind of shadow section. So now, because we set both as hard light, I just want to take the opacity a little bit, about 70%. At the bottom one, probably leave around, if not even 100, probably leave it about 90% to 100. I'm actually going to leave at 100. So this is the base shadow for our eye element. So now we're going to create another layer, and this time set it to clipping mask, but we're going to choose the color of the eyeball itself. However, back into the layers panel, we're going to set this as an add mode. And now change your brush back into the very harsh one. So let's increase the thickness a little bit, about 25%, and let's just draw another circle. I'm actually going to make a little bit thicker, so about 45%. Let's make that circle. Hold with your other hand onto the canvas so that you can draw a perfect circle. And now let's bring this to the inside of the eyeball. But we actually only want more or less at the bottom of the eyeball. So using the edit shape capability here with the quick shape, we're expanding the top area, just kind of leaving the bottom section inside on the eyeball. Now that we have this, we're going to hit the arrow to apply these changes, go into the adjustments layer, go into Gaussian blur, and blur this a little bit. Let's do about this much. Now, back into the layers panel, we're going to go into the opacity and set this to about 40%. So right now what's happening is that we're starting to add, as you can see, volume, light, and shadows onto this eyeball. I'm just going to drop this a little bit more to about 25%. Okay. So now we're going to add one more clipping mask. So let's just turn that on. And once again, use our harsh brush. Draw another circle. And I will have to position it. I actually have to undo this action because I forgot to set it to additive mode. If you didn't notice, what happened here is because I'm using the same color as the eyeball, once I draw the circle, I can't really see what's happening until I set this layer as add. Because by setting as an additive mode, that same color as the eyeball all of a sudden looks almost like white. And I could have done the same using a white value and a normal blending mode. But just for the sake of this video, we're using a very reduced color palette. It is more about how we can play with blend modes and opacity. So I'm going to click Edit Shape. I'm going to position now in the following manner. I'm going to now now all that we want is the top section to be catching this highlight. So we're going to position more or less like so here. And I'm going to hit the arrow to apply. And now in terms of Gaussian blur, we're only going to apply a very, very small number. It's probably about 5 to 6%. Now go back into the opacity, tweak that a little bit, but I'm probably going to leave it about 20%, and I'm going to move this up a little. All right, so now we got somewhat of a shading happening on the very first section of the eyeball. Now we need to continue applying layers onto the other layers of our eyeball. So now we're going to choose the teal or blue section, make a new layer. As you guessed it, set it to clipping mask. Go into our colors, set the darker kind of tone that we have on our color palette. And in the brush selection, we're going into the airbrush. Now what we're going to do, probably bring this down a bit. We're going to draw another shape just like so for this second section. Go into the adjustments menu, Gaussian blur, apply a little bit of blur, and that's it. So this is now adding shadows onto the second section of our eye. And I'm probably gonna set it to multiply and about 85% opacity. I do have to say that I think on the camera, the highlights especially are catching very, very bright. This is not what it actually looks, at least on my side here, but I'll probably tweak it because I don't want to give you guys the wrong impression of what this actually, what this drawing looked like. So I'm gonna go back into the highlights here, set that first one to about 10% opacity, and the bottom highlight, I'm probably gonna set it about 15% opacity. All right. So now that we have these two things done, we're now going to start adding some highlights onto these little sections here. And those are actually going to be much simpler. First thing that we're going to do is just duplicate our teal element. And then at the bottom one, go back into the colors, select the brighter color that we have, make sure we have our bottom teal color, drop it at the selection of the teal element. It has been painted with this color, it's just we can't see because we have another copy just on top of it with the color teal. But if I turned it off, you can see we have our element right here. In terms of blend mode, we're going to set to add, and now just using the adjustments menu, we're going to blur that a little bit. And as you can see, what's happening right here, we're adding a bit of a rim highlight onto that same element just by duplicating it and Gaussian blurring it. So it's expanding those pixels, and it's doing that for us without us having to scale that up and then kind of repositioning. We don't really have to do all of that. So about the size of the blur is about 6%. I'm going to apply that, and on the blend mode, bring it down. I'm gonna set it to about 40%. Same will happen to our topmost layer. Make a copy, duplicate, select the bottom version, paint it with this brighter color. Set the blend mode of the bottom layer to add, apply adjustments, Gaussian blur, 6 to 7%. Set it about, 6.7, hit OK, go back into the opacity, set it about 40%. All right, now with these two layers, what I do want to do, I'm just gonna zoom in a little bit, because we've blurred it in a very uniform way on both axes, like top and bottom and sides, I do wanna move it just diagonally. I just wanna move this kind of like on a diagonal, kind of moving down a little bit, because I do want this, since we've been illuminating on a diagonal, I just want to bring these elements down just a bit so that it makes sense with what we're creating. So I've done that with that little element that we just added color, opacity, and blend mode. Now I want to do the same with this one that we did with the teal one. So I'm just going to bring that down as well, just a bit. And now if I zoom out, we have something that looks a little bit more directional. So now that we have that, we're going to go back into our eye here. At the very, very top of everything, we just add a layer, go back into our brushes, make sure we're using the harsh version, and I'm just going to bring the size down a bit. We're going to make a circle if I can, so I'm just going to bring down even more the size, make our first circle, drop that color. In fact, here I'm just going to set the color to screen in this case. So this one is not going to be add. These are the highlights that we're creating right now on the whole eye. And if I set it to add, it becomes very, very harsh, almost like really, really the brightest as it can be. So screen, it's a nice blend mode because it's adding a little bit of highlight without going super, super overblown. So we've done our first circle. Now we go and we create a bigger circle right here. Just gonna move that about here. Add some color. And finally, maybe a little one about here. Once again, drop that color. So now that we have these elements, in terms of opacity, I'll probably set it to something high, but just enough so that we can see kind of what's happening. So maybe around 85 to 90. It's gonna leave at 85 for now. But what we want to do is to actually apply an adjustment layer of Liquify. I'm just gonna drag this a little bit. As you can see, it already adds this nice motion. And what this motion actually is mimicking is that the eye is in a spherical element. So these perfect circles will be actually quite hard to actually be represented if we're dealing with the sphere. So with spheres, they add distortion already to the elements. So doing that to the reflections will kind of add some really nice movement to your illustration, and at the same time, kind of taking away from what we see, what we perceive as reality. So now I'm going to apply that, and with the move tool, because we just dragged it around, I just want to bring it back just a bit. So something like this, or play it around to whatever position it feels better to you. I definitely want to move at least outside of that little black iris. So something like this for now looks pretty good. So now we're almost there with our illustration. I'm just going to go back here into the layers panel, create one more layer, set this one to, I believe it's going to be screen. And in terms of the brush that we're going to use that harsh brush once again, make it really big, and just draw kind of like a circle like this. I'll probably do a little bit shorter. Now what we're doing here, we're just going to create a very dreamy kind of highlight onto the overall illustration. So in order to do that, we're going to go into the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and add a lot of blur to this element. So something like this. And because it's very faint with the amount of blur that we've just done, we're going to duplicate this element a couple of times. So now that we have this, we're almost really there. All that we have to do now is kind of go back into our shadow that we've put here on the floor and just make that a little bit more realistic. So same way as we've created a couple layers for shadows and a couple layers for highlights, same goes with the shadow on the floor. The more layers that you create, the better your result can be and will be, because you will have more control of the amount of blur, amount of opacity, and the reach of each shadow section. You'll understand what I mean. So in order to get that done, we do always have to make a duplicate and turn off that layer, because we're going to be creating multiple copies. So the very first one, the bottom one, we're going to go into the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and this one is going to have a lot of blur, because this for now is going to be our widest kind of shadow. We're going to apply, and with our second one, make another copy, turn off the top layer. Now we're going to reduce the size. So we're going to be working outside in. So we're making this shadow right now, making sure it's smaller, much smaller than the first one, going to the Gaussian blur, and now we're going to blur it, but we're not going to blur it as much. So as you can see, we're compounding this effect, and we're creating a harsher shadow each time we go in. And I hope the camera can capture that. So what I'll do on the bottom one, I'll probably start adding some opacity so you can see this a little bit better. So the bottom one is probably getting about 70% shadow. So I could kind of leave it like this for now, but if I wanted, I can make one last one. So once again, I'm going to duplicate just to keep my backups, and keep moving this by mistake. So I'm just going to make this really small, about this size, and add some Gaussian blur. And that is my last one. And going into the opacity, probably set this to about 60%, because the compounding effect of all these layers, even setting to a lower amount, gets compounded, gets darker. And now we're really almost there. We just need to do one final highlight to the overall eyeball. So that is a good question. Making a new layer here, how can we create something now that we have several layers, several clipping masks? How can we create something that applies just to the eyeball and not to the red parts, as we now have everything broken into layers? So let me show you how we can do that. So now that we have our element created, I'm going to set this last element as screen and make sure that we have our harsh kind of studio pen selected, size about 12%. We're going to create this really nice kind of a curve that kind of goes and cuts all of this region of the eye. And I'm also going to close that shape and put some color into it. So now that we have that, I'm going to click on to this layer, which is our base layer. Click once again, select, hit the select option so that I can select the mask of this whole eyeball. And now click on our topmost layer, the one that we just drew this shape. Tap once again and select the option mask. So now we've created a mask with the whole eyeball so that we don't have to worry if we draw or paint anywhere outside the bounding area that we want. And now we can just tweak the opacity, which I'll set it about 18%, 18 to 17%. Now in terms of effect, just a little bit of Gaussian blur just to not make things super sharp, but a very low amount. I'm just going to set it about 3%. And that gives us this kind of a final shine, kind of like a shining layer or a highlight onto the whole eyeball. So I'm just going to zoom in and fit this drawing onto the canvas area. And that about does it for this illustration, guys. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I hope it wasn't too fast. I wanted to somehow make this into a video that was enjoyable to watch and follow. So if you have any problems, always make sure to play this video at 0.5 speed. You can do that in the settings of the player on YouTube. You can set the video play speed to something much slower. And if you really enjoyed this video, a like would be super appreciated, as well as make sure to subscribe to this channel for more news, tips and tricks and reviews, and that is all to make you a better digital illustrator. Now on the right side of the screen, there's more content for you to learn on Procreate and other digital applications that may interest you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Ciao.